Whether you believe addiction is a disease or not, if you suffer from addiction, it may not be your fault. Gabor Mate explains that society generates addiction, creates the tendencies and connections that addiction is dependent upon. You may know the great Gabor Mate from his many books, The Return to Ourselves, Trauma, Healing and the Myth of Normal, and of course in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. Gabor was kind enough to come on my Luminary podcast, Under the Skin, which you can get from Apple, or you can just download the Luminary app directly. Here he talks about what it is to live in a society that requires of us that we become addicted, that consumerism, commodification are aspects of addiction, and that if you yourself are an addict, the way that those tendencies, feelings and habits got inside of you are very revealing and say a lot more about culture than they do about you as an individual. Why do you think that pain is not addressed in a conventional 12-step ideology?
Because I think pain is painful. That's why I think it is. So it's easier to believe that I have this disease that I inherited, this disease model, rather than to recognize I wasn't loved the way I needed to be loved. I was hurt by the people that were supposed to love me. I was hurt by the people that did love me. Not only did I experience suffering then, I still carry the imprints of those suffering. In order to let go of those imprints, I have to take a real in-depth look at myself, and without judgment, and with absolute curiosity. And I might experience severe distress as I look at that pain. Well, those are difficult. That's the first. So the first reason is individual. The second level is it keeps you from having to confront your family history. Mm-hmm. It's very painful to come into conflict with your family history, even though trauma is not anybody's personal fault. It is passed through generations. And number three, we live in a society that, in your own book, you point out, is largely designed around helping people escape from their daily consciousness. We don't want to talk about trauma in this society. Trauma is what keeps the economy going. So there's personal, familiar, and social reasons.
That's excellent. So you think we live in a culture that has a vested interest in sustaining a state of trauma, and possibly the majority of people at some level are living on with a stimulus response model that broadly fits the addiction paradigm, even if it ain't an extreme addiction such as substance misuse, or an obvious one such as severe eating disorders. It may be through consuming, use of pornography, negative codependent relationships. Would you say that possibly many people are living in this way, unaddressed?
Well, there's a book entitled When Society is Addicted, and I agree, this is a highly addicted society. In fact, large segments of the economy survive because people buy things that give them temporary pleasure but do them no good whatsoever in the long term. In fact, they're even harmful. I mean, we're going so far as to destroy the earth because of our addictions.
Consumerism requires the addict mentality. It requires a cycle that cannot be surmounted by rationale.
Exactly. Consumerism demands a mentality in which I fundamentally believe that I'm insufficient without this external fix. That's what consumerism relies on.
So your understanding of addiction on a personal level can be extrapolated in a social analysis. You think that our society conforms to that idea. You would agree that it is an addicted society.
Well, you point out the same thing in your book, Revolution, pretty much. And my own next book, which will be entitled The Myth of Normal, Illness and Health in an Insane Culture, is going to make the same point. In other words, when you look at a society, you can't just look at it from the inside. You have to look at, if you're an anthropologist from Mars looking at this society, what would you see? And what would you see is a society that creates artificial needs rather than meeting people's genuine needs. It creates artificial needs, and it creates artificial needs because the economy relies on that.
Whilst none of us would ever be able to claim the mythical or metaphorical aliens objectivity, because obviously we're all a product of this society, how, accepting what you say, how can we ever individually or culturally overcome such an imprisoning mentality?
Well, I think the 12 steps themselves, insofar as they go, are designed to help liberate people from an imprisoning mentality. And I think that that's one example of transformation. So there are many forms of transformation, some spiritual, some psychological, some political. But it always depends on letting go of a certain point of view, or getting outside a certain point of view, and seeing its limitations.
In your earlier rejection of a moral framework, or at least your querying of a moral framework as resourced through 12 steps, you said that no one ought be condemned through a kind of moral paradigm that is an expression of human dysfunction, I think was the phrase you used. I sensed there an optimistic and even utopian view of the human psyche as a kind of ultimately benign and loving destination.
Well, interesting that you would pick up on that from the little that I said, but it is the way I see it. But it's not utopian. It's actually evolutionary. Human beings would not have survived with anything other than a compassionate relationship to one another. The baby would not survive. And no human infant would survive unless there was a natural drive in the parents to be compassionate and empathetic towards that infant. Even rats are wired for compassion. If you look at laboratory rats and look at their stress hormone levels when they're watching other rats being hurt, they'll be more stressed when the other rat is being hurt than when they're being hurt themselves. Because mammalians are wired for empathy. Without that, there's no social life and there's no taking care of the young. So it's not a utopian view, it's actually an experiential and evolutionary based view.
In those terms is what you describe as empathy a challenge to the individualistic worldview. The boundary of the individual may not be that the individual may not actually be contained within the skin if we're hormonally or biochemically experiencing the pain of others. What indeed is separation?
Well, what happens is we're born with this vulnerable openness for the most part. Now, some people are already wounded in the womb as fetuses and as babies, but most of us are born with a vulnerability and an openness. To the degree that that's hurt or not responded to or not received, we shut down. And now we're looking at the world from the shut down, limited, individualistic perspective, in which we're driven to be egotistical because that ego is seen as our self-defense. But that hurts us at the same time because it goes contrary to our true nature. So the more egotistical we become, the more successful we might even become in the world in terms of worldly terms, but the less happy we become. So there's a contradiction between that constricted ego, which is a product of trauma, and our true selves. That's how I see it, and that's my understanding of human beings.
I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to Luminary. You can get it from Apple wherever you are in the world. If you don't have an Apple phone, you can get it off of, just get Luminary elsewhere. You can just download the app. Let me know what you thought of that conversation in the comments below, please. Do you suffer from addiction? Is it a weird kind of addiction or straightforward drugs, alcohol, gambling, that kind of stuff? Let me know how you deal with your own addiction. Has spirituality played an important role? And do you feel that you sometimes live in a world where addiction is being engendered, fostered, created by the conditions within which you live? Please subscribe to this channel, Awakening with Russell Brand. I need you to do that, and I need you to give this video a thumbs up and share it around. If you're watching it elsewhere, consider going over to YouTube and signing up for Awakening with Russell Brand. If this video was helpful to you, have a little look at this guy. It's a little bit deeper in the same direction. And if you want to have a little meditate or some well-being time, have a look at this. Please subscribe to my mailing list at russellbrand.com so I can remain in direct contact with you always. Thank you.